Chapter 23, Schemes and Things. Somehow I continued to avoid the traps of the law. In a Los Angeles courtroom, Johnny Cochran, my attorney, persuaded me to accept a $100 fine and 6 months probation for the charge of assaulting a police officer. As long as I wasn't doing time, I didn't trip. After shaking my attorney's hand, we parted ways. With the court case behind me, other troubles found me. There was a bookie called Chunky who knew a white guy in debt to him for $5,000 for gambling. Chunky gave me the guy's address along with his description and said, "My brother, if you can collect the money, half is yours." Now, though his offer was gracious, I planned to pocket everything. Nothing personal, just a crip thing. When I knocked on the white guy's door in Gardena, Wayne stood off to the side. In these kinds of situations, I felt I had the upper hand. The guy was living foul, and for him to call the cops would be a joke because he was considered white scum. The moment the guy opened the door, I grabbed him by the collar and demanded Chunky's money. He said, "I only had $200 in my wallet." When he handed it over, I asked what else he had that was worth the debt. The guy blurted out, "Take my car. It's a 1975 Monte Carlo that should settle the debt, and I can sign over the pink slip right now." I smiled and said, "Okay, but we'll go to the DMV and have to put it in my name." At the Inglewood Department of Motor Vehicles, I paid for the registration. Then we left to get a smog device. The car was legally mine. Throughout the day, I spread the word that I won the car in a big dice game. However, the next morning some cops showed up to inform me that the owner of the Monte Carlo claimed I took his car and forced him at gunpoint to sign over the pink slip. Therefore, if I wanted to keep the car, I'd have to submit to a lie detector test to prove that I didn't coerce the guy into giving me the car. Once again, I found myself at the Glass House police station. I failed the test. But when they completed testing me and the white guy, I heard a detective say the test showed that we were both lying. That's when I also heard a female officer whispering to other officers. I was told the white guy was lying. There was no weapons involved because Tookie had been under surveillance. Before I was released, a detective said if either one of us wanted to own that car, we'd have to go to small claims court. For days, I toyed with different schemes to get that car back, but decided the hassle wasn't worth it. If nothing else, the ordeal confirmed my suspicion that I was being followed, that it wasn't paranoia or my imagination. Here I was, painted as the villain. And this was the type of cop harassment that inevitably leads to a frame-up or extermination. Being harassed was business as usual. This became evident one early morning around 3 a.m. when Michelle and I were asleep, and there was a loud knock at the front door. Moments later, an excited Jackie banged on the bedroom door, alerting me that a battalion of cops were outside, for me to be careful when I came out. In a gallant gesture, I told her I'll go out first, just in case they started shooting. It was pitch dark as I eased down the narrow hallway to the living room, where I had to weave past a maze of weights and benches. Through the open front door, I could see Jackie spread eagle on the wet grass surrounded by cops and a helicopter overhead. The door was open and an armed cop barked out, "That's right, Tookie. Just keep walking with your hands up and don't try any crip heroics." Outside, I was ordered to lie down next to Jackie. Moments later, Michelle was lying beside me. While we were on the ground, an elderly lady named Opa, who lived 2 houses down from me, stood several yards away. I had known Opa ever since my family started living on 69th. She was my mother of 5 sons and a daughter. Her 2 youngest sons, Frank and Aaron, would as teenagers become Crips. Opa stood there demanding to know what the problem was. A cop told her there was information received that gunshots had come from inside my apartment. Opa shot back, "Gunshots? That's odd, because I've been awake all this morning and I haven't heard anything until you guys and the helicopters arrived." Although she continued to protest their harassment, it was to no avail. Meanwhile, a cop came out with a huge grin, holding up my AR-15 and a pump shotgun. He asked if I had ownership papers for the weapons. When I produced the documents, it seemed to piss him off. As soon as the cops finished searching the apartment, one of them warned me, "Make sure you watch your back." When the cops had gone, Opa asked, "Tookie, why are they always harassing you? And what in the world have you been doing?" I smiled and said, "Miss Opa, your guess is as good as mine." It was John who approached me with a hand-brained scheme to rob a particular church of its monetary offerings. I looked at John as if he were Mephistopheles himself, then said, "Hell no, are you crazy?" Even after he told me it was an inside job, that his cousin had helped him, and that there was nothing there to stop us, I couldn't do it. I had been immoral to the bone, but I was never crazy and sick enough to desecrate, vandalize, or stick up a church. But mobbing other criminals wasn't a crime. In fact, it was open season on them. Whenever my homeboys and I heard about a dope dealer, street jacker, bookie, hustler, thief, or any non-crip who had come across some money, he was in trouble. Like myself, most of my homeboys didn't put much stock in their lives. Case in point, Eastside Crip Siles was daring enough to rob an Eastside gambling shack. He knew there was a strong possibility of losing his life, but the potential for financial gain outweighed the consequences. Siles probably would have escaped with the loot, but the back door and windows were nailed shut. Siles was shot dead, another youngster's death for a worthless cause. May he rest in peace. Then there was Mac Thomas, a Compton Crip leader turned full-time hustler. It was said that his adopted running buddies were the shadiest of characters, but he insisted on being with them. I remember when Mac was released from the youth authority, he told me that he was no longer interested in cripping, and his conversation only revolved around hustling. He tried in vain to convince me to hook up with his crew, but I declined. Later on, from what I gathered, Mac's life was snuffed out by some of his hustler cronies who wanted his share of the heist. I didn't know too much about Mac's last days, but he was another Crip companion who was around during the early days of the Crip legacy and became another black statistic dying from a thug lifestyle. Personally, I have known hundreds of Crips exterminated while traveling down the path of drugs, gangbanging, pursuing money, whatever. But I wasn't intimidated by the possibility of death and continued to sift through the schemes coming at me from all directions. On one occasion, Sweetback approached me with sketchy details about a score that involved mobsters needing some outside help to pull a big heist. There were tens of thousands of dollars to be made by each of us. Though Sweetback didn't know the mobsters personally, his friend James Garrett knew them. I thought, why not? If we were being hoodwinked, well, mobsters could bleed just as quick as any Crip or Blood could. The plan was for us to meet the following day at the Marriott Hotel, not far from the Fox Hills Mall, to discuss the heist. When we arrived at James' home on 104th Street Western, in the living room were Juice and Hillbilly, two 83rd Street gangster Crips I had known since their childhood. After a brief chit-chat, we caravaned and parked down the street from the hotel. I noticed I wasn't the only one packing. A few other weapons were flashed in a show of confidence and readiness. Inside the hotel, we waited at the bar until a short, stocky Italian guy wearing a suit and tie appeared. He briefly talked with James and his hefty wife, Esther. Before they left, the Italian told us that someone would be down to get us, but until then, the drinks were on the house. Meanwhile, as I sat around looking uneasy about the entire setup, two other mobster-looking guys in suits appeared and motioned for us to follow them. Once upstairs, one of the mobsters turned around and said with an Italian drawl, "Okay, the boss doesn't want anyone in the parking lot." Once upstairs, one of the mobsters turned around and said with an Italian drawl, "Okay, the boss doesn't want anyone in there packing heat. It's for security. So if you're holding something, leave your gun with my partner here and you'll get it back on the way out." I failed to comply. When we entered the room, two scantily clothed white women were holding silver trays of hors d'oeuvres. On the table were more refreshments and an open black duffel bag on the floor, exposing numerous handguns. I sat in the chair next to the slightly open window in case there was a need to jump down several stories. Minutes later, two figures, one black and the other Italian, both in suits, entered the room. It was the tall black guy who began talking about jacking a train that supposedly carried a shipment of high-tech weaponry and hundreds of thousands of dollars in UPS bags. While he continued to talk, another Italian guy entered the room with a huge suitcase and pulled out a replica, the type of rifle that would be on the train. The weapon was impressive, twice the size of my AR-15. It resembled a James Bond rifle with a long clip and silencer. But I was still suspicious of the setup, and the black dude just didn't fit in with the Italians. Maybe this was how the Italian mobsters did business, but before I left, I wanted to hear more. To my surprise, the black guy broached the subject of each of us having to be questioned prior to the heist to determine if we had what it took to pull it off. Being the last one to enter the separate room, I was asked, "So Tookie, how many people have you killed?" The query caught me off guard. I almost stammered when I told the guy, "Hey dude, I never killed anybody before." The guy said, "Look Tookie, everybody in town knows you're a dangerous dude and that you have a reputation for killing people." I stared that dummy in the eyes and said, "Whoever told you that is a liar." He tried to laugh it off to ease the tension and said, "We need someone like you who has the guts to kill." Infuriated, I told him, "I'm not a killer, I'm a fighter." Back inside the living room, I told Sweetback I didn't like the setup and was ready to leave. Seconds later, the door burst open with plainclothes cops rushing in, hollering, "Lenox Police, FBI." A quick glance outside the window revealed cops down there, pointing their guns up at the window. For me, there was no escape. We all were handcuffed and driven to the Lenox Police Station, then transferred later to the Los Angeles County Jail. At the court arraignment, James, Esther, and Sweetback were released, but I had to reappear in court the following day. Both Juice and Hillbilly had pending charges of allegedly robbing a Big Five sports goods store for its guns, and I was charged with possession of a loaded weapon, which I had stashed earlier under a couch pillow. Unknown to any of us, James and Esther had conspired with law enforcement to set up a sting operation. For many years, James had been an agent, provocateur, working undercover with the FBI, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, better known as the ATF, and other law enforcement agencies. He was a paid snitch, ready to lie, frame, fabricate, and commit whatever duplicitous act his law enforcement masters commanded of him. Needless to say, James was playing a deadly game. In Africa, a snitch would undergo the African-style necktie. A car tire would be placed around his neck, doused with gasoline, and set afire while a jubilant crowd watched. Back in the Los Angeles courtroom, the judge dismissed the charges against me for lack of evidence, but years later, I'd be charged again for the same offense and much more. I was used to it. Happiness was something I'd never experienced.